The distinctive style of Mr. Paul Coker Jr. welcomes us to this lovely Christmas special. My name is Mark Evanier, and I'm going to be hosting this for a little while here. The voice you're hearing now is that of Jimmy Durante, the great comedian. We'll talk about him later. But it's fascinating to me that he is doing what is probably the only cartoon show he ever voiced in his life. We're surprised by that because we've heard his voice for years in other cartoons, imitated by a raft of other people who probably sounded more like Jimmy Durante than he does here. But this was the only cartoon we know of he ever did, and it was one of the things that made this special very special. The story of Frosty the Snowman starts with a song written and recorded in 1950 by Gene Autry and the Cass County Boys, written by Walter Jack Rollins and Steve Nelson. But it probably really starts with Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, a song written in 1939 by Johnny Marks, but it was a huge hit record in 1949 for Gene Autry. And since show business abounds in people trying to replicate previous hits, the Christmas season after that, Mr. Autry recorded this Frosty the Snowman song, which was also a huge hit. So it's very appropriate that years later, after the Rankin Bass studio had had a huge hit with their Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer special, they tried to follow it up with Frosty the Snowman.
And so, I put the magic eggs into my hat. Abracadabra, to coin the phrase. And voila, the eggs have turned into...
The voice you're hearing of the magician is that of a man named Mr. Billy DeWolf, and he was always referred to as Mr. Billy DeWolf. He was a character actor who was very popular in 1940s movies, often seen wherever Doris Day was lurking. And at the time he did this special, he had just come off a one-season situation comedy called Good Morning World, which is best remembered for having introduced Goldie Hawn to television. Mr. DeWolf played these fussy, officious little men, and a minute ago you heard him say, messy, messy, messy. That was written in for him. His catchphrases were always that kind of three complaint lines. Like he would walk onto the Johnny Carson show, where he was a frequent guest, and always say, busy, busy, busy. So you'll hear the magician do that frequently throughout this special.
Hey, look at the snow! Yeah! Oh, the snowy. Yeah, it's the best kind of snow, too.
The other voice that's of interest to talk about in this special is that of June Foray, and why it is and isn't in this show. June Foray was, of course, the first lady of cartoon voicing, the most important voice actress who ever lived, the voice of Rocky the Flying Squirrel, Natasha, a couple of Smurfs, Granny and the Tweety and Sylvester cartoons, and hundreds of others. You can Google her and see an endless list. She's doing the voices of some of the little kids you're hearing right now here. And in the original special, she was the voice of this girl, Karen. She was the voice of several of the children, and at some point, and it's in dispute when it was, the Rankin Bass people went back in and redubbed her voice and some of the others with real children as opposed to adults sounding like children. We still hear June in this special. She was the voice of the school teacher. She's heard in all the crowd scenes, and occasionally little lines of sneaking with her voicing small children. But in the final release version, that is the one that aired after a couple of years and has been out on home video sometimes, the voice of Karen was redubbed by an actress named Suzanne Davidson. We don't know exactly when she did this, but she was born in 1963, so she presumably would have been about 6 or so or 7 when she did the redubbing, as did a couple of other little actual children. No one really seems to know for a fact why this change was made, but it is presumed that it had something to do with the success of A Charlie Brown Christmas, which was the most successful Christmas special of its day, that made it fashionable to hire real little children to voice little children in cartoons. So the assumption is that someone decided that rather than have June Foray, who at that time would have been in her 40s, I guess, play Karen, they would have an actual little girl. The redubbing was done, and the end credits do not reflect that. The end credits are from the original June was in. Suzanne Davidson went on to become a successful actress as an adult. She had a long time on the TV soap opera As the World Turns, and very little else is known about her. She probably was very proud to be part of this special because it is rerun over and over again, and she's probably annoyed that her name is nowhere on it.
You realize that snowman can't come to life.
But we...
Silly, silly, silly.
Oh, Frosty, we don't care what grown-ups say.
The other interesting voice in the show comes up right now. It's that of comedian Jackie Vernon, who voiced Frosty the Snowman. We'll get to him in a minute, but let's talk about Jimmy Durante a little bit here, since he's singing for us. Jimmy Durante was a beloved entertainer, and it may be difficult now for people who weren't familiar with his career to understand why he was so beloved. He sang in an odd manner with a voice that you would not associate with a singer, yet his records were very popular. He was a funny man, but he wasn't funny the way a lot of great comedians were fall-down funny. He was just beloved. People just loved listening to him. They loved looking at him. They loved listening to him. It was a very sad day for this country when Jimmy Durante passed away. It is sometimes reported that this was his final performance. It actually wasn't. This show first aired on December 7th, 1969, so he probably recorded his part early that year, maybe even late in 68. Jimmy Durante's last major work as an entertainer was as a TV series called Jimmy Durante Presents the Lennon Sisters, which ran on ABC from September of 1969 into March of 1970. So when this show aired, he was still being seen every week on another network. He had a stroke a couple years later. He passed away a couple years after that, and the country mourned. His presence in this special added a certain importance to it. It was very customary in these Christmas specials to get a big celebrity, a primetime voice, someone who wasn't just a cartoon voice like June Foray or Paul Frees, who we'll hear in a minute. The way Burl Ives was in the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer special, and Boris Karloff was in the How the Grinch Stole Christmas, Jimmy Durante added an air of great importance and familiarity for adults to these shows. So did Jackie Vernon. Jackie Vernon was at this time a very popular stand-up comedian, seen often on the Ed Sullivan Show and the Dean Martin Show, and any place they hired stand-ups. Mr. Vernon was a very interesting performer visually because he was almost expressionless on stage. Had been around for years doing his act in vaudeville and in burlesque and strip clubs and other places until he broke through kind of in the early 60s on a Gary Moore series that showcased new talent. And also on the Ed Sullivan Show, he would come out, and he was the most deadpan comedian you ever saw. He'd come out looking very dull. If you don't know who he looks like, Google a photo of him someplace, and you'll understand this better. He would come out, and his opening line would usually be, "To look at me now, you'd never believe that I used to be a dull guy." That was funny, should give you some idea of how dull he looked. And then he followed up by saying things like, "At parties, I used to stay in the room with the coats, memorize labels." And he'd go on and on about how girls weren't interested in him and people ignored him. And every so often in his act, he would haul out a trumpet and he would play the worst rendition of Stardust you ever heard in your life. It was completely off-key and bad and terrible. And coming from this guy who was so deadpan and sincere, it was very, very funny. It is odd that he is remembered probably best for this show because he usually did the kind of act that you wouldn't show to kids. I saw him in Las Vegas near the end of his career. He passed away in 87, I think, and I saw him there about 1985 at the Marina Hotel, and he was hysterically funny. But if anybody went there thinking, oh, there's the guy from the Frosty the Snowman special, they were probably surprised by the nature of his material.
I always wanted to see the town. Let's make a party out of it. Let's have a parade.
Frosty the snowman knew the sun was hot that day. So he said, let's run and we'll have some fun now before I melt away.
The song here takes us off and on through the story, and the man who adapted this special was a man named Romeo Mueller, who wrote most of the Rankin Bass shows, and was very, very good at taking these, sometimes a song, and turning it into something. As we'll see later, he took a 3-minute song with very simple lyrics and turned it into quite a lovely story, and came up with an ending for it. We're going to talk about that near the end when it's not a spoiler to discuss it, just in case you're the kind of person who listens to commentary tracks before you actually watch the show.
Say catch me if you can.
Come on, kids. Follow the leader.
Let's talk about the man who, for me, may be the superstar of this entire special, Paul Coker Jr. You're looking at his designs right now as you are through this entire show. You're seeing his distinctive lettering style in the credits and the graphics and on the signs in the background. Mr. Coker was a superstar in the world of greeting cards at one point. He grew up in Missouri, and like most people who grew up in Missouri and could draw, he wound up at some point working for the Hallmark Cards Company. And he designed hundreds and hundreds of greeting cards that captured the interest of people who were in buying a card for a birthday or a get well wish or congratulate someone on their bar mitzvah. He was, of course, not happy to remain his entire career doing greeting cards. Neither was one of the writers who worked for Hallmark at the time, a man named Phil Hahn, a very clever man who went on to become one of the top comedy writers in this country. In the 60s, he migrated from Kansas City to New York, and one of the markets for which he began writing was Mad Magazine. He became one of their star writers. At some point, he suggested his old friend Paul Coker should be drawing for Mad, and when Coker moved to New York, this happened. They called him the usual gang of idiots in Mad Magazine. He was one of the usual gang of idiots. To this day, he still occasionally does a drawing for the magazine, decades later, but his unique style fit into Mad very well, and it turns out it lent itself to animation. He not only did designs for many of the Rankin Bass shows, he also designed hundreds of commercials and a few other cartoon specials, and his work was seen in advertising. A very prolific man. But this show kind of robs us of one of the charming parts of his work. He had a unique pen line that would make everything thin that should be thick and everything thick that should be thin, and he shaped his figures and formed his designs very cleverly. If you see his actual drawings sometime, you'll know what I'm talking about here. When you turn that over to an animation studio like the Mushi production studio in Japan, they're not doing work with that kind of pen line, and they couldn't replicate it, although they did do a very nice brush shaping around Frosty. He's got kind of a unique thick and thin line there that helps define the figure very nicely. But Coker's artwork was so distinctive that people recognized it even before the credits on these shows, and we love him very much.
You just can't melt.
Oh, Karen, don't you get all slushy, too.
What is it, Hocus? Out the window? A refrigerator?
The Mushi Animation Studio in Japan produced hundreds of cartoon shows over the years, some of them subcontracted from American studios like Rankin Bass, some of them original to Japan. They are best remembered for this and for the Astro Boy show, which we all watched and loved dearly. The other person we should talk about in the voices, who I passed over while I was yammering about other things, was Paul Frees. June Foray was the first lady of animation voicing. Paul Frees, if Mel Blanc and Dawes Butler had not been around, Paul would have had the trophy in that category. He was an amazing talent, heard in thousands of TV shows and commercials like all of these people we're talking about here. Earlier we heard him voice a policeman, we heard him voice the guy at the train station doing the mail. Later on we're going to hear him play Santa Claus. Paul's voice was heard in more shows than you can believe, including the Mr. Magoo special that we all know and love. He was a very versatile man who was often dubbing other actors. You've probably heard Paul in places you didn't know it was him. He was Boris Badenoff, of course, on the Rocky and Bullwinkle show. He was Toucan Sam in the Fruit Loops commercials. I can fill the rest of this commentary track by listing Paul Frees' voices. It's fascinating to hear him pop up in motion pictures. If you ever watch the film Bells Are Ringing with Dean Martin and Judy Holliday, June Foray and Paul Frees are all throughout that film dubbing other actors and doing voices on telephones. About the same time they made this, they were heard in the Dick Van Dyke movie Divorce American Style. Paul was in the Dick Van Dyke movie The Comic. These people worked constantly. I worked with June Foray an awful lot. I co-wrote her autobiography with her, and we had to remind her of things she'd done. She did not remember even doing Frosty the Snowman. It was one day out of thousands of assignments in her life. She knew it because people would come up to her and tell her how much they loved her in it. They would also tell her that they loved her in Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, which she was not in, but for some reason her name keeps popping up on the video release boxes. Paul had the same situation. This was probably 2 hours work in his life. It is a show that will rerun forever, keeping his voice heard forever, and yet it was something that he probably didn't remember very well after he'd done it. That was the situation with all these voice actors like Paul and June, who worked constantly throughout the 50s and 60s into the 70s and 80s.
Frosty wanted to get as far away as he could before Hinkle woke up.
We are into the place here where Romeo Mueller has taken us into a storyline that is not necessarily suggested by the song he was working from. That was his problem. He had to take this short little song and fill out a half hour with it. It was the same problem that the people who took the Dr. Seuss book of How the Grinch Stole Christmas faced. They had to take and pad out the story and flesh it out. It's the same situation that Mr. Mueller had when he had to adapt Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, not into a half-hour special, but into an hour special, which meant adding a lot of characters and new situations, and yet being true to the basic premise of the song. He managed this wonderfully, and here he gets in a very sad... I remember this scene being kind of scary. Was Karen going to make it? Her life is suddenly now at the mercy of this magical character who popped out of nowhere. And I just felt real sad when I watched this show the first time, comforting myself with the knowledge that it was a Christmas special, so could not possibly have an unhappy ending. We'll see in a little bit how Romeo Mueller dealt with the fact that the song does end with Frosty kind of going away forever. This is Hocus Pocus. He was kind of a scene stealer. The vocal track on him, which you can't hear too well in this show, suggests that maybe someone was thinking he kind of would do for this show what Snoopy did for the Charlie Brown specials. He's got kind of the same kind of non-verbal squeaking voice that we don't know the name of whoever supplied it. But now the story's getting a little happier, and it's going to progress that way. By this point, though, I found when I watched this show every time that I really started caring about these characters. In a couple of interviews, Arthur Rankin said that they had made a conscious decision to not try to go for a Disney look with this show, and they picked Paul Coker because they thought his characters were expressive and different from the Disney look. That's a nice sentiment. I suspect, though, that they didn't go for a Disney look because when you were doing a cartoon show for American television then, the budget and the ability of the artists that you could get probably made a Disney look impossible. I'm glad it doesn't look like Disney because I find these characters very expressive and very interesting. They are malleable. Frosty seems very alive. He seems kind of magical. And people notice that the number of fingers he has on his hands keeps changing throughout the show, and the number of petals on the flower in his hat keeps changing, and there's a few other little anomalies that probably occurred as the animation passed from one artist to another. It doesn't matter. The voice is expressive, the faces are expressive, and I just believe in Frosty. I believe he exists, at least for the duration of this show.
Waiting patiently all through the night until Santa would arrive. But suddenly...
And I believe that Professor Hinkle here, our magician character, exists, even though I don't know why he keeps going various shades of green and yellow. The voice is expressive, the character is expressive, and the dialogue is very clear, on the nose, expressive, emotional. There's not a wasted word in this script here. Mr. Mueller did a very good job here of keeping your interest every second. And ask yourself as you're watching this without listening to me, aren't you fascinated right now? Is there any chance in the world you're going to turn this show off before it's done? You know there's going to be a happy ending somehow, but you're dying to see how it is, how Professor Hinkle gets his comeuppance somehow.
And old Professor Hinkle was soon far out distant.
And now the story kind of slows down a little bit. We get to the nursery here. Jimmy Durante is guiding us through the entire story. Most likely, the voice actors in this show were recorded individually. Durante probably came in and spent one afternoon recording all his stuff alone. I believe Jackie Vernon, the one time I talked to him about this, said he had not met Jimmy Durante on the show. But the directors, the producers managed to tie it all together. It sounds like these people are talking to each other, even when you're listening to Frosty talking to Karen, who was dubbed in a couple years later. Jackie Vernon probably never met the actress doing Karen and did not act opposite her. Yet it holds together well. Animated specials these days, animated features, tend to do their voice tracks frequently in what they call splits. The actors are not in the same room at the same time. That's opposed to the gang method that June Foray and Paul Frees were used to from the Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoons, where all the actors were in the studio at the same time, and they tried to do the entire cartoon in one take or maybe one or two continuous takes.
Santa had arrived, but was he too late?
And now here we have Santa Claus, voiced by that same man, Paul Frees. Santa Claus is Romeo Mueller's answer to how you end this story when the song basically ends with Frosty, our hero, melting away forever. What Santa Claus brings to us in this story is a feeling of eternity. Santa Claus is an immortal character, and he blesses Frosty with the same mantle. As you're going to hear, he tells us that Frosty will be back. So this scene starts with, here's Karen crying because she's lost her little friend. And if the story ended right here, it would be in keeping with the song, but it would be a very great downer for people watching this show. Leave it to Santa Claus to save us.
Frosty, the snowman, was a happy, jolly soul.
And here's Jimmy Durante summing up the story for us. And at this point here, you may be worried there's a sad ending coming. You may be missing Frosty the same way. You may be feeling very sad and going, no, this isn't the end of Frosty, is it? Well, Santa's not going to let that happen, is he?
Too late? Why, nonsense. Oh, don't cry, Karen. Frosty's not gone for good. You see, he was made out of Christmas snow. And
Christmas snow. There you are. Nobody dies in Christmas snow.
Oh, it sometimes goes away for almost a year at a time and takes the form of spring and summer rain.
And Santa Claus sometimes goes away for a year at a time, but we know he'll be back. And Frosty's going to be back. This is the part I really love about this show, because you got this song that ends sadly, but it wasn't that sad when it was just a song. For this show, they've given Frosty the Snowman a personality, a voice, a humanity that he didn't have in just a song. And so now he comes back. And he's going to come back year after year, not just because he's Frosty the Snowman, but because they're going to show this special every year. That's one of the nice parts of it. Santa's telling us that Frosty will be back every year, and sure enough, the next year they ran this show, and the next year they ran this show, and the next year they ran this show, to the point where kids of my age, and I'm 66 as I'm doing this, thought that Christmas wasn't Christmas unless you had Frosty the Snowman, and you had Rudolph, and you had the Grinch, and you had Magoo, and you had Charlie Brown. Those were the big 5 Christmas specials for us, and they defined our holiday season to a great extent.
More anything.
Oh, that's not fair.
And the nice part is that here you've got this magician who's the villain, and he's not that bad a villain. We kind of understand him. We kind of forgive him. He's not an evil character. In Christmas shows, everyone's redeemed to some point, which is the nice part about Christmas. It's the time that families that fight don't fight as much. It's the time when people declare their love for one another. It brings out the best in people, and we've brought out the best here in this kind of crooked bad magician, too.
Got to get busy writing. Busy.
So thank you, Santa, and thank you to the Rankin Bass people for bringing us this lovely little story here, which we're going to have for the rest of our lives. If it isn't even aired next year, you're going to take out this DVD or Blu-ray, and you're going to watch this again and again, because it's part of your life now. And so is this song. Before this show came on, I knew this song. I heard it all the time on the radio and such, but I didn't have a visual to go with it. It was just a song. I cannot hear this song now without thinking of that version of Frosty the Snowman and the kids and this story. I don't think that Christmas specials these days have that effect on people. They don't become perennials in our life the way this show did.
Great celebration with a big Christmas parade.
And there's Mr. Mueller's credit, well deserved.
Look at that Frosty go.
The credit for the song, Steve Nelson and Jack Rollins. And there's Paul Frees and June Foray. And no mention whatsoever of the kids like Suzanne Davidson, who redubbed the kids' voices years later. Paul Coker Jr., I think, is the hero of this thing. The Mushi Studio did an amazing job. There is no such thing as a TV Christmas special animated that was not animated in a hurry. They have firm deadlines. When you agree to do a non-holiday special, the network can always reschedule for a later date. But the day that the Rankin Bass people committed to CBS to do this show, they probably got an absolutely firm delivery date which could not be deviated from. And they had to meet it. And they sure did. It's a very lovely show, and we're very pleased to have it with us on this DVD or Blu-ray or whatever you're watching this on. This is Mark Evanier, sitting here in the middle of May, feeling he should go out and do his Christmas shopping.